Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second in this semester's series of Critical Conversations. For those of you who are watching for the first time, Critical Conversations is a series of events that link key contemporary issues to the work being done by our university museums. And they explore how the St Andrews community, so both staff and students, can engage with their activities and their plans. So just a bit of housekeeping to start. If you want to switch on live captions, you can do so by clicking on the 3 dots on your menu on screen. Please also do use the Q&A function if you wish to ask a question. There's going to be lots of time for discussion in the second half of the event tonight. So I'll begin by introducing myself, a bit about our topic, and then our panelists today. My name's Emma Bond. I'm an academic in the School of Modern Languages, and I'll be moderating tonight's conversation. This semester, we're talking about a huge issue facing museums at the moment, the climate crisis, and what museums can do to promote and encourage activism and behavioural change. We're focusing on this because the next exhibition that will be held at the Wardlaw is called Dive In. Dive In is a call to action to protect our ocean. We're surrounded by the ocean in St Andrews and very lucky. So what we want to do with Dive In is engage communities in how they can protect the ocean. And there is this emphasis on driving behavioural change and prompting visitors to the exhibition to take action. So this evening, we are very lucky to have no fewer than 4 brilliant guests with us to discuss museums and climate change. We have Dr James Rae, who is a reader in the School of Earth and Environmental Sciences. He is an oceanographer and a climate scientist, and he's done some fantastic work on raising public awareness of climate change, including a TEDx talk that you can look at on his website, and developing educational resources. So we're really looking forward to learning from his expertise and his experience in these areas. We're also very excited to be joined by Maddi Kuras. Maddi is a current postgraduate student studying on the Museums and Galleries MLitt, but she did her undergraduate study in Arctic ecology and climate science. So she's combining these two for her master's dissertation and working on climate activism in museums. So she is a big expert that we need to learn from. Last but not least, we're going to hear from 2 undergraduate students, Lottie Evans and Millie Sutton. Lottie is a 3rd-year student in Geography and Social Anthropology. Millie is a 3rd year in IR and Geography. And these 2, in their first year in St Andrews, I think they worked on a Global Challenges project in the School of IR, which led them to setting up TESA, the first mandatory environmental training module to be used in a UK university. So we're looking forward to hearing more about TESA and the work that Lottie and Millie have done in encouraging interest in sustainability in the student population. So we're going to start with brief presentations from our panelists, and they're going to share a bit more about their interests and the questions that underpin the event. And as always, we'll link our conversation back to objects that we hold in the museum collections. So you'll find links to these objects in the Q&A tab. This week, we'll be looking at pictures of specimens held in the Bell Pettigrew Museum that were collected by the HMS Challenger back in the 19th century. And I know that James has worked with some of these specimens and some of the drawings made of them also in the classroom or the lecture theatre. So let's pass over to him now. Thanks, James.
Okay, thank you very much, Emma, and thank you everyone for coming along this evening. It's a pleasure to be speaking about this, one of my absolutely favourite and most kind of central topics to, well, really what I do every day when I wake up in the morning, which is think about the ocean's role in climate change. So the ocean plays a vastly important role in Earth's climate. We are on a blue planet. The surface of our planet is 2/3 water. That water is 5 kilometers deep. We are surrounded by the oceans right here in St Andrews, but our globe is predominantly ocean. So it plays an important role in the climate system, and it plays a particularly important role for kind of 2 major reasons. One is that the ocean can shuffle heat around the planet. So we're warmed here in Scotland by the Gulf Stream waters that originate in the Caribbean. Secondly, the ocean takes up CO2 from the atmosphere. And so that is helping currently reduce CO2 levels in the atmosphere, but it doesn't come without consequences. So the ocean, as a result of that CO2 uptake, is getting more acidic. So it's these roles of the ocean in changes in circulation and heat transport, but also in changes in CO2 that I study in my research and I teach about in the School of Earth and Environmental Sciences. And I'm particularly interested in how they've changed in the past so that we can better understand how they may change in the future. And to investigate these kinds of things, I use a variety of different research tools. Some of those are computer models, but most of my research centers on looking at specimens, either modern or ancient. So the kinds of things picked up by the Challenger expedition back in the late 1800s, and that we still collect on seagoing expeditions. So most recently, I sailed from Hawaii to Alaska to look at the ocean's role in CO2 uptake and how that was impacting marine life. So I'm really happy to answer any questions on the kind of climate science or CO2 side of things, and on a whole range of timescales from our geological past on into the future. And I guess I'd also just kind of put in a quick nod to a kind of more active climate outreachy side of things that Emma mentioned I do. I'm very kind of enthused and passionate about climate change solutions as well, so I'd be happy to speak to that too.
Brilliant, thank you, James. Maddi, can we hear next from you about your work kind of combining climate activism, science and museums?
Absolutely, you can. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me. I am so excited to be here tonight. Climate change, climate solutions, and museums are topics that are very, very close to my heart. So I am so excited to share my passions and contribute to this wonderful conversation. A little bit about me. I am from Sydney, Australia originally, but moved to the United States for my high school and undergraduate education. And I fell in love with museums late in college, specifically wanting to explore the ways that museums could communicate climate change. I'm a science communicator by trade, and I've found that museums provide a truly amazing platform for these difficult conversations and really help the general public digest complex information a lot more easily. Looking at St Andrews specifically, I am a postgraduate here at the University of St Andrews. I'm pursuing an MLitt in Museum and Gallery Studies. A number of us in the program are actually working on an exhibition right now with the Scottish Fisheries Museum, which is titled By the Seaside, Heritage, Healing and New Horizons. And this exhibit really aims to explore the impact of blue space, which is oceans, rivers, any kind of water system, on the human experience and on well-being, while emphasizing the sea's influence in art, heritage, and science. This is a really, really exciting exhibition, as the sea is very, very close to the hearts of many residents along the Fife coastline. And although COVID has meant that the majority of the exhibition will be online, we are hoping to open an in-person exhibit in April. In the meantime, we are promoting By the Seaside in our podcast, over social media, and on our website. And our virtual opening will be on Saturday, the 20th of March, which will have a bunch of amazing panelists, including Dr. James Rae from the University of Exeter, who is very famous for his Blue Health project. So hopefully we can see people there. On the topic of climate solutions in museums specifically, as I said, this is something that is very, very close to my heart. I've worked in a number of museums that really focus on providing climate solutions to the public. And so something that I have learned in my professional experience is that museums have this really unique opportunity to reach really wide and varied audience. And the public really places a great deal of trust in the information that is put out and found in museums. So really, museums have to capitalize on this reach in terms of not only climate solutions, but using their programming to not simply educate the public, but also empower the visitors to take action. As we know, climate change can't be only solved by individual action. It needs systemic change as well. But as we've seen in the climate marches of 2019, individual action can lead to systemic change. And so I believe, and as I am trying to have a look at in my dissertation, as you mentioned beforehand, museums and other such trusted institutions really have an obligation to be a part of that movement and educate as well as empower. So that is essentially me, and I'm so excited to be a part of this conversation. And I will hand the mic back to you, Emma.
Thank you very much, Maddi. There's so much food for thought in everything you said. Lottie and Millie, I don't know whether you want to kind of go together or whether one of you wants to go first and the other one afterwards, but we'd love to hear more about you and about your work with TESA.
Hi, thank you, Emma. Yeah, it's really exciting to be speaking tonight, and thank you for inviting Millie and I here to be part of this really important discussion. So yeah, in our first year, Millie and I joined and met in geography lectures on Welcome to the Anthropocene and A World in Crisis, and we were learning about this age of climate change, but we weren't necessarily given the optimism or the hope for solutions at the same time. And I guess a lot of people can be stumped by the overwhelming scale of the challenge we're facing. Framing it as a crisis is important, but it can also be off-putting and overwhelming. So I guess part of our ethos for coming up with TESA was this idea that everyone can make a difference, that individuals not too small to do anything. So the everyone, everyday ethos that we developed together really is at the heart of TESA, which is a practical and action-based module to train students on sustainability. Because the university, it's an educational institution and it's a place of learning, and we really wanted to reach everyone with learning on sustainability that doesn't just stay in the classroom, but it goes out into their lives, in every room of the house and in their gardens. So yeah, it's a practical based module, and it has that ethos that the individual can be part of a movement that really does have a cumulative impact and make a difference. And I guess the idea of trying to reach every student was what was unique about TESA, that it wasn't just there for those who were already keen about learning about climate change or already geography students, but it gave a sort of foundational level of sustainability knowledge to every single student. And those who thought that they couldn't do anything, or they thought they weren't interested, maybe had an opportunity there to realise that there was something they could be part of. So I think the timing of TESA it's tied in well with the climate strikes, the sort of Fridays for Future that Greta Thunberg really pioneered. And yeah, I think it's shown that students and youth and the younger generation are really important in this movement we're building.
Definitely. Thanks, Lottie. Millie, would you like to carry on?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so if I'm just building on what Lottie said, we just wanted to make students feel empowered, really, because we felt like we couldn't do anything and we were quite a small cog in the system. And we realised that if we just gave people a baseline education, baseline knowledge, and tried to make people feel empowered, that was the most positive thing that we could do. And we wanted it to be about communities as well. So we wanted students, or whoever's taking the module, to go out into their community and say, hey, I think we should change this. And that's also quite a powerful tool, we believe, as well. Happy to be challenged on that. And we hope that TESA will have a bigger impact than just in St Andrews. And we're also really happy that students have engaged with it, and we hope, fingers crossed, that'll keep going into the future. So yeah, that's all I have to add.
Brilliant, thank you. Actually, Millie, if I can keep you on, or Lottie, or both of you, I was wondering about how you're measuring the impact and the kind of positive effect of TESA. Is there a way that students can kind of log their actions and log the kind of things that they're doing through the module?
Yeah, so we've got a little, it's like a little downloadable kind of help guide, but it's not a help guide, it's just something that we hope students can build into their everyday routine. So it's even things like, you know, if you go to Costa, take your reusable coffee cup. Admittedly, with COVID, that's so much more difficult. But we're hoping that students will download it, and then we're kind of tracking the number of downloads from that. We don't have any kind of statistical evidence, but we've worked with transition and the environment team, and they have said that they've had more uptake of bikes to hire for the semester, and the tree, which is like an organic, locally produced kind of cooperative, really, which is associated with the transition, has had a lot more orders and a lot more uptake. So we're not sure whether they're directly correlated, but it's possible.
Great, thank you. Such exciting work going on. James, if I can turn back to you, obviously you deal with the kind of hard science of all of this. How can you make that accessible to people? What are the challenges of trying to communicate climate science, and how do you get over them?
So it's a great question, Emma. It's something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, that breakdown. For me, I like to split it into what I call the 3 S's of climate change. That the science is simple, that the problem is serious, and that it's also solvable. So simple, serious, and solvable. And if I kind of take each of those in turn, you know, the fundamentals of the climate science really are kind of no more complicated to understand than the fact that a blanket or a warm jumper like this one keeps you warm. If you stop heat escaping, you trap that heat closer to your body and you stay warm. And the same is true of the influence of CO2 on our planet. And we've known that for well over 100 years. This was actually kind of first hypothesized by Joseph Fourier back in the early 1800s. And then it was Eunice Newton Foote, a American female scientist who actually did the first experiments on this and has been kind of too long forgotten about. So given A, she was the actual person who discovered it, B, in particular, Women's Day yesterday, we should remember Eunice and her amazing role in that discovery. And then all the kind of pieces of this were put together in a paper by Svante Arrhenius, who is in fact, or was in fact, Greta Thunberg's great uncle. And he put all of this together in a paper in 1896, which correctly predicted the influence of CO2 on planetary temperature. He predicted also that it would have driven climate change in the past and that it would drive climate change in the future. So those fundamentals we've understood for well over 100 years, and not much has changed about them. Now, the more complicated things are trying to understand, exactly what will happen on a particular, in a particular place, what some of the impacts might be in the future. But again, it kind of boils down to the fact that with every extra joule of energy we trap at the planet, we give storms more power. We make it easier for water to evaporate. That makes dry places drier and more liable to fires. It makes wet places wetter and more liable to flooding. So the more CO2, the more warming, and the more impacts. And in some sense, that's kind of it. The science, at its heart, has this kind of simple underlying physics that I teach in first year lectures to anyone who's taken 1001 or 1002, and this kind of myriad array of impacts, but they all get worse as you put more CO2 into the atmosphere. So what do we need to do to fix it? Well, again, actually, that's very simple. We just need less CO2 in the atmosphere. How we get there is, of course, a bit more complicated, because that's out of the realm of science and into the realm of people. But at its heart, there's a huge amount of excitement and hope there. I mean, the way that renewable electricity is taking off is just incredible to watch, and defies predictions year on year. It's not going to be without its challenges, fixing this, but we know what we need to do. We need clean energy, and we need to make as many things that currently run on fuel run on that clean energy. And at the same time, we need to stop chopping down trees and replacing them with cows. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. So I'd be happy, of course, to talk about any of those topics in more detail. But at its heart, I think it's important to remember those simple facts, and I'd encourage anyone listening, when bombarded with at times baffling information by the media about climate change, just to remember, well, CO2 is a greenhouse gas. That means it traps heat, and the more heat you trap, the more you can evaporate water or melt ice or raise sea levels. You will not find anything actually that disagrees with that, or that disagrees with the fact that to fix this, we need less CO2 in the atmosphere.
Great, thank you. Super clear. Maddi, if I could turn back to you next. You talked about museum programming going beyond education, which I thought was really interesting. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about what specifically museums can do to encourage people to take action over climate change.
Yeah, absolutely. I can speak to that. So I guess the way I can speak to that is by highlighting some previous experience that I had with a museum that did that extremely, extremely well. And I think before we go into solutions and empowerment, one of the things that, as other people were stressing beforehand, one of the things that museums need to do is to educate. And museums do that really, really well. They provide a fantastic forum and place for conversation to be had that is safe, that is comfortable. People can engage with the material on their own time. It's not confrontational as it would be potentially in a conversation between two people. So museums do that really well. They provide an excellent opportunity for education. And I think that is the main goal of museums, is to educate. But in terms of moving beyond education to moving to something that isn't just education and programming, it's empowerment. That leads a little bit more into the emotional. So we have to remember that climate change, it is, as James was saying beforehand, it is a scientific problem, but it does deeply affect people. And each person in each community is going to have its own different experiences with climate change. They will have looked around and seen the ways that their community has changed and the environment around them has changed throughout the years. So everyone is going to be impacted. Everyone has an emotional reaction to this information. What museums are singularly able to do is provide a place where people can be empowered. And for example, the place that I worked beforehand was at the Climate Museum in New York. And this was before the climate strike in New York City in 2019. They had this really fantastic exhibition called Taking Action, where it was not only, it didn't just focus on young people, it really gave young people, young interns, the opportunity to not only educate, but be educated. So it was run and controlled almost entirely by youth activists, and gave all of these young people and visitors a platform to engage with the information, but also move on from the information and do things with that information. So whether that would be calling your bank, that banks are a huge actor within the climate crisis. Also looking at how you use the land, looking at your diet, but also how much CO2 you emit personally, finding out who your political representatives are and feeling that you can contact these people and say, okay, this is what I want, this is what I want to do. So that museum really gave people that went into that museum a fantastic way to engage with the information, but also feel empowered to fight this really, really pressing issue, which I thought was just fantastic. So I think in the future, if museums are going to be looking at programming that is, to be frank, can be bleak. People can consider climate change programming to be quite bleak. If museums are going to be providing programming like this, they need to be able to give the visitors an opportunity to feel empowered. They need to give them actions to do. They need to give them a way, not a way out, but a way to engage with that information after they leave the exhibit itself. And I think a lot of museums are doing that really, really well at the moment. Did that answer your question?
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much. Lottie, I was wondering, I mean, but we've had so many kind of really concrete examples there from Maddi about the kind of work that museums can do and empower people to do. I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit more about specific things that St Andrews students can do, and I can see there's a bit of a conversation going on in our sort of speakers chat as well about breaking down barriers, both to kind of to engagement with climate change, but also barriers within access to those spaces as well. So I don't know whether you want to just speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. I was just going to add on to Maddi's point. You said about museums being comfortable spaces, and I guess I was just thinking that that's obviously not the case for everyone, and there's obviously a lot of certain groups that probably, you know, maybe have never been to a museum in person and never accessed those spaces, and in some ways that's quite a privileged experience to be taken to museums and to feel comfortable in them. So I guess I was thinking that we've got to be careful and critical about that as well, and whether during the pandemic with online, you know, here we are online at a free event, whether we can actually maybe break down some of those barriers by having online engagement. But at the same time, there's nothing that can take away a face-to-face engagement with some of those objects. And that was one point on the access. And also secondly, on the issue of feeling comfortable in those spaces, I wondered if we actually need to sometimes feel uncomfortable, especially here, we're a white panel, and we probably do need to feel uncomfortable about some of the histories that we need to, you know, the decolonisation that needs to go along with the decarbonisation. So yeah, I guess sometimes we do need to feel uncomfortable, but I agree that making those spaces accessible is really important. And yeah, Emma, on your second point on the sort of practical action in St Andrews, that's completely what TESA is all about, not just in St Andrews, but wherever a student's home is. And we're a very international student body, so that's all around the world, in every continent. And it's just a few examples, I guess. You know, we're a coastal town, so beach cleans would be a really feasible one that a student could do. I know that my flat this week, we've just done them in a lunch break as an activity, and we actually collected nearly a bin bag each down by the aquarium. So that was shocking, but you know, it's a very easy way that a student could see the tangible impacts of climate change and make a difference at the same time. And like Millie said earlier, bike pool and different sustainable travel modes is a really important one. And obviously not everyone's able to cycle, we understand that, but for those who can, choosing not to drive and choosing to take, you know, take the bike rather than the car to travel somewhere is really important. So yeah, I'd say cycling and beach cleans and changing lifestyle products as well would be a few really easy everyday changes students can make here in St Andrews.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Lottie, for all of those really important points. I think James wants to come in. I would also just want to say to the audience quickly, if you do have questions yourself, do get them in the Q&A. Post them in whenever you like, and we'll get to them as soon as we can. If you want to ask them to a specific person, then just put that in the chat as well. We're really excited to hear your thoughts as well. James.
I just wanted to jump in with one, I think, essential other thing that anyone listening to this can do, which is contact your elected representatives. So any politician will say that actually at times it can be a slightly lonely business, that they will not be contacted as much as you think they might, and that for every letter that they get or email that they get, they assume that that is just the tip of their iceberg, that a huge number of others of their constituents will be thinking about that same problem. So please bombard your politicians with the fact that you care about this issue, the fact that you want it to be something central that your locally elected representative is representing your views on. And do also look out for specific examples of projects that they can support. For instance, planning approval for new wind farm projects, or policy approvals for things like removing gas-fired boilers in homes and replacing them with heat pumps. So please prod your representatives, because they can really make an enormous difference.
Brilliant, thank you. Maddi, I know that Lottie and Millie kind of raised quite a lot of maybe problems that museums might have in being the sort of spaces that people encounter these kind of issues in. Is there anything that you could say to this issue of the kinds of baggage that museums might have, and the way that they can address any of those issues through programming or through their exhibitions?
Yes, absolutely. And I just want to say that I am not by any means speaking as a representative of museums on the whole. So what I can say is what I am trying to do in my dissertation specifically is really challenge what museums are currently doing. So I can speak to that, but I am not speaking as a representative of museums in general. So in terms of what museums can do, Lottie and Millie really did raise some fantastic points, because they're right, it is a privilege to be able to go to these spaces and have access to these spaces and feel comfortable in these spaces. And they're right, like, you should not feel entirely comfortable with all of the information that is portrayed in these exhibits, because a significant number of this information is not comfortable information. And this really continues on with the idea of decolonization and decarbonization. Decolonization is a huge issue that museums are facing right now, because a lot of these museums do have really intense colonial pasts and colonial legacies. Just looking at the British Museum and the Louvre, to name a few, there's a lot of things that are going on with repatriation at the moment, discussion of returning objects, but also really having a critical look at the objects that these museums have and the provenance of these objects. So who are these people that donated the objects, and why were they in these spaces to begin with? So it's an ongoing process that museums are trying to do. And the way that I see it is they're not currently doing enough. And I don't think they will ever be able to do enough in terms of issues of decolonization. But in terms of making programming accessible to all, which I believe was the question, what museums can do is, if they need to remember that a lot of these museums represent the communities that they are in. They not only serve the communities that they are in, but they represent their interests as well. And there's a really exciting program called the EULAC program, where people are figuring out this certain kind of museum called a community museum, where these museums really do represent the interests of the communities that they are in. They go into these communities and say, what is it that you want from us? Like, what is it that you would like to see? And they really do listen to what people are saying in that regard. And to be fair, it is easier for smaller museums to do this work. But I think it is a really, really good template for other museums to follow, is to really think about who these exhibitions are reaching. Who are they reaching really? And trying to fill these gaps, especially when it's for information that is quite as important as climate change. Museums have an obligation to reach as many people and as varied audiences as possible. And to be frank, if they aren't reaching everybody, or if there are gaps in their engagement, then they're not doing enough. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Maddi, for that answer. We've had one question in from somebody in our audience, which is a little bit about these kind of different responsibilities and how different museum groups are perhaps targeted. So, Millie, I think you wanted to come in on this one and just think a little bit about those kind of differential responsibilities.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. Differential responsibility is so hard, and it's something that I think Lottie and I have thought about in the work that we've done, because we're very conscious that there's a huge inequality of resources that lead to you kind of, I don't know, it's such a, I don't know how to say it in the best way, but you know, if we've got the privilege of using all of these resources, then we also have a responsibility to mitigate our impact. And I think that really links back to this whole conversation about decolonialism and kind of listening to marginalized voices. You know, women in Thailand or the Maldives or you know, Bangladesh, you know, these are the people that are on the front line of the climate impacts, and they are the ones that are being hit the hardest, but they're the ones that are using the least resources. And I think differential responsibility is something that we need to think about more in the West, and I think it really links back to history and how kind of the geopolitics of knowledge has been shifted in the West's favour, and I think that these narratives of exclusion are still playing through the climate conversation. We are pushing onto other countries here in the West that, you know, it's everybody's responsibility equally, and actually if you look back, it's really not, and I'm very happy to be challenged on that. But it's something that I've been thinking about for a little while, and I feel like it's such a difficult topic to even begin to address, and I just wanted to acknowledge that as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Millie, for that. I wonder, James, you obviously take this kind of long historical look as well at climate change, and in thinking obviously through histories of dispossession and oppression, sometimes that kind of historicisation is a way of kind of facing the past in order to move forward with a future that is more sustainable, whether that's in terms of dealing with legacies of empire and colonialism in society, whether it's trying to deal with climate change. I wondered if you could say something about this approach that takes a kind of long historical lens, and if you see that as being something that could have a positive impact in the way that people understand and kind of act on the science.
Well, yes, I guess my historical lens might be kind of so long that the kind of human historical record is not really in focus all that clearly. In that much of the work that I do looks at climate change on timescales of thousands to tens of thousands, if not millions of years. But I think in terms of kind of tangibility of engagement, imagining those worlds, the world of the Ice Age or the world of the dinosaurs, I think does provide a really kind of easy access point to thinking about how climate really can be different on a global scale, and ties into a lot of the work that museums would already and traditionally be doing to explore those different realizations of our planet. And there's real opportunities there, I think, for highlighting the kind of climate connection. In terms of, though, the more kind of human historical lens, I agree with all these points that have been made really, really eloquently, that the idea of climate justice has to be central to what we do as we inform others about this problem in the work of museums. And it places the onus on the historical polluters, which is the Western world. I mean, you'd be amazed to kind of realize that until relatively late in the 20th century, kind of 1950s, 1960s, the UK had the most cumulative CO2 emissions because of that enormous industrial revolution. So we have this, we've done the most to cause the problem, and we will probably be less impacted by what's going to happen than many others. So the onus is on us to do the most we possibly can to fix the problem. I will also say, though, that please don't just think of this as something that will happen to people, kind of somewhere else. This will touch all of us globally, even in places that might not feel it as acutely. This is something that is happening kind of close to home already. And so, how does that kind of compel us to move forward? Well, the theme of this conversation, and indeed the series, is conversations, and I guess if I give one kind of final plug, it will be, please continue this conversation. If you've watched this, talking about climate change is actually the easiest thing to do, right? It doesn't require you to go anywhere or spend anything, but it's actually something that's done amazingly little. So please do talk about climate change to your friends and family and solutions, and keep this conversation going.
Thank you so much, James. We've got a couple of minutes left, so if anyone has any burning questions from the audience, then type fast, because we'll be here for about another 2 minutes. And if not, I wondered, Maddi, if you just want to kind of talk a little bit more very briefly about this idea of the kind of emotions involved in climate change as well, and you spoke about the exhibition by the seaside in terms of a healing as well. So in order to try and end on something of a positive note, I wondered if you could talk more about this kind of well-being aspect as well.
Yeah, I absolutely can talk about that. So by the seaside specifically is focusing on this idea of the human interaction with the idea of blue space, which is essentially oceans, river systems, any kind of waterway is categorized as blue space. And there's been a number of psychological studies, including the Blue Health Project that I mentioned beforehand, that essentially point to the idea of human health and psychological health and mental health being really improved by being near water systems and interacting with water. So that's one of the things that By the Seaside is really trying to have a look at, especially in this time of COVID, where a number of us are very, very stressed and people's mental health has taken a significant blow. We are really trying in an exhibition form to create a space where people can go to feel comfortable and feel more in tune with the ocean and in tune with their mental health, and see how the ocean has really inspired thought and art and heritage and history and science throughout the years. But speaking more to the emotional aspect of climate exhibitions specifically, I think the more an exhibition can curate some kind of emotional response, the better it's doing. Because to be frank, you can't look at climate data or what's going on with the climate crisis and not feel, I mean, you shouldn't feel emotionally detached from what's happening, even if it isn't right in front of you. It is going to be impacting you. And as Millie and Lottie said, it's going to be impacting different groups very differently. So this is an incredibly important topic to engage with emotionally. And I think that is one of the really fantastic ways that the Climate Museum specifically tried to target their audience, is go for the heart. It sounds awful, but like really just to impact someone's heart and say, look, you love a certain aspect of the world, of nature, and this is going to be changed. Your livelihood and your life is going to be changed by this thing if we do not do something about it. And I think that's something that I want to remind everybody who's listening in, is that it's not, it might seem far away, but it's not. So we really do have an obligation to do something about it. And museums, as I said, as institutions of learning and trusted institutions, have an obligation to really act against this serious problem.
Thank you so much, Maddi. That's a perfect moment to end on, I think. And just to remind everyone about By the Seaside, the exhibition at the fisheries, about Dive In, to remind you also that the next Critical Conversation will be on the 13th of April, so look out for that. And just to thank so much all of the brilliant panelists tonight, James, Maddi, Millie and Lottie. Thank you all so much for a brilliant and critical conversation.